I want to talk about how we solve climate change, because it's not just a matter of planting trees anymore. The way we solve climate change is actually mobilizing communities, bankrupting businesses, and even shifting governments. Our industry of climate solutions sees technologies beyond our wildest beliefs. From technologies that can suck carbon dioxide out of the sky, to powering cars using water, and even restoring our ancient soil ecosystems. We're at a point where we can't change the past of industrial emissions. But if we don't do anything, our future ahead doesn't look too bright. So what do we do now at this in-between? I think for the longest time, I thought that we could recycle and paper straw our way out of climate change. But I always had this fundamental sense of dissatisfaction because I had extended family in the Philippines who was suffering from rising sea levels. And here I was bringing in my reusable coffee cup into a store in Vancouver. But what else can you do when you're a university student in Vancouver just trying to make sense of the climate crisis?
So we first got acquainted at UBC, at Common Energy. Yeah. I think very fondly about those days, honestly. Like just really innocent, hey, this is how we're gonna solve climate change. Like through these like niche, only catering to students. Not only over yeah. Like we just threw these free vegan dinners every month. That was a good time.
This is my friend Shakti Ramkumar. She's also the Senior Director of Policy and Communications at Student Energy, which is a global youth-led organization working with youth all over the world to accelerate a just and sustainable energy future. We actually first met at a sustainability club on campus.
I think the biggest thing or realization for me is that the way we get to the sustainable future we all dream of, that matters, the means and the how we do things matters. And it felt like Common Energy was kind of embodying the future that we would like to see, one that's collaborative, that is focused on community building, that is welcoming to people from all backgrounds, because I think Common Energy was one of those climate clubs that was easy entry. You just show up and you get dinner and maybe you stick around, maybe you don't. It was very low pressure. And I think that embodies the spirit that I would like to see in the future, where sustainability, climate, energy futures are not this elusive, technical, gate-kept things, but something that is actually community-centered. So for me, that was the big realization, okay, the way we get there matters just as much as what we do and where we end up.
When you think about Common Energy and what you're doing today now in climate, how do you feel like it's evolved, shaped, changed since then in terms of how you think about approaching sustainability?
Well, first of all, I'm glad it happened in that order, where I did Common Energy and other activism at university first before I got started in my current role as Student Energy.
What kind of activism was that?
Working on divestment. I would do things like organize our database, do outreach, and doing a lot of canvassing for elections and campaigning for climate candidates and that kind of more grassroots-based organizing. I'm glad I had that experience first and really built friendships and relationships from doing that work before I got to my work at Student Energy, which is more global, which sometimes feels a little bit it can feel like you're untethered from where you're based, but the energy sector is global, so we're kind of meeting that challenge and working with global youth as well. So my work has evolved in that I think it's become a lot more policy focused. Since I started at Student Energy, it's a lot more global in terms of we think a lot about what are intergovernmental organizations getting accomplished, what are large multinational companies getting accomplished, what are young people doing on the global scale. And I'm glad I have the grounding of having a firmly local experience first.
Yeah. How have you seen decision-making show up when it comes to allocating funding for climate solution?
It's really interesting to witness sometimes because It feels like there are forces, unseen forces, like beyond the understanding of any singular youth organization that affect like where finances are mobilized. And on the plus side, I've seen how advocacy really results in the way finance is mobilized, particularly from small island and developing states. From a lot of like countries that are most impacted by climate change, I see how their fierce advocacy really punching above their weight in terms of like the representation they have in these spaces, but calling for bold financing mechanisms on loss and damage funds. Like we see that happening because of the advocacy of these like relatively small number of actors. So on the plus side, I think I really see that happening. Same goes for philanthropy. There's been a lot of activism by frontline activists, by young people, by Indigenous people on, how philanthropy can't just go to these like established environmental organizations, but needs to support actual frontline work. And then usually it's like 6 months down the road, a year down the road, you see some result from that advocacy show up in like new pledges that are made or new finance that's announced. So I would say that's like the plus side of how I see like grassroots public youth advocacy show up in financing. But on, I think, the side that I'm still personally trying to still understand is the role that geopolitics plays in what technologies are invested in or focused on, and also just the influence of private sector or how the private sector interfaces with the public sector in mobilizing funding. Like where a lot of young people are paying attention to the Inflation Reduction Act in the States and similar climate pledges that are made by countries, and how a lot of them are really centered on the public-private partnership aspect and are created or mobilized, implemented with the intention of like incentivizing private sector technology companies, startups, innovative companies to produce certain things. So we see a lot of focus recently on things like hydrogen, like carbon dioxide removal. And I'm always curious to know like what was the root of that decision? Was it the like climate, like this is the best fit for our climate needs and our emissions reductions pathways? Or is it responding to like industry interest in accelerating these specific technologies over others? So I'm still learning on that.
Do you think there's an answer to that? Like, what's your hunch? Like, is it one or the other?
Yeah, I mean, my hunch, it's probably not as black and white as I think. I think there's always like a need for R&D for developing new technology and new technological solutions. And it makes sense to me that there's industry interest in pioneering something new, receiving funding for it, for countries to have an interest in like being the leader in a certain technology. So I think that makes sense, and I understand why funding's mobilized that way. But I also worry that there isn't that same level of energy for other solutions. Like there's a lot of existing technologies, existing climate solutions that are chronically underinvested in. Things like energy efficiency, is the rate of improvement in energy efficiency globally is so much slower than it should be to meet our emissions reductions goals. And that does worry me because these are technologies that largely exist, could also use innovation funding, could have numerous co-benefits in job creation and improving health, livelihoods for communities, but continue to not receive that level of media attention, policy attention, or like investment, excitement, and energy that newer technologies or emerging technologies do. So that I do worry about, is whether these, at work we always call them unsexy solutions, whether the unsexy solutions are receiving the level of attention that we think they deserve based on their emissions reductions potential.
That's an interesting discussion because folks often say that, yeah, we already have the solutions. It's just a matter of getting these things like energy efficiency technologies to scale. And so why do you think it is that they just haven't reached the scale that they need to?
I think that's a good question. I think part of it might be because a lot of those technologies are quite decentralized. There's like energy efficiency isn't like one proprietary technology that like a company or a few companies could own and, like market as their product. I think that's my hunch, is that that's one of the reasons why it's harder to invest in them, why they maybe are not as enticing or lucrative for private sector to pursue is because there are a whole array of, sometimes low tech or, like older solutions that can be deployed by a city. They could be deployed by a company. They could be deployed by a particular building even. And so because of the decentralized nature, it might not jive with the like innovation, venture capital, like that whole ecosystem that like incubates innovation. These technologies may just not fit that mold, and therefore they receive less attention, less investment.
I came to pretty similar conclusions as Shakti as I aged out of the university climate action community and got a grown-up job. In that role, I learned that there were entities way beyond me that were developing solutions and scaling technologies and making and losing millions of dollars off of what they built. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that these entities were making decisions that would impact me or will impact me in my lifetime. Decisions like what kind of car I'm going to be driving or where my electricity is going to be coming from. And these weren't things that I necessarily could choose. So when I looked to my peers and looking at what we could choose, it looked like some of us chose to deal with it firsthand.
My name's Audrey Shea. I work as a ski patroller at Cakenware Mountain Resort, and I also am a wildland firefighter from the Columbia Zone.
I feel like just 2023 in general was like such a big year for fires. Like it made the news internationally. And so when you're doing the job on the day-to-day, how do you think about that relationship between, like you're fighting fires on a daily basis, but also the climate's changing and these fires are getting worse? Do those thoughts kind of run through your mind, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, definitely. It's hard to not think about that stuff too. And I think there is this kind of like ecological side of wildfire where like forest fires aren't bad, like it's like obviously it kicks up a bunch of air pollutants and like pollutes the air and stuff, but it's like for forest health, it's not a bad thing at all. It's just kind of like fuel mitigation at that point, but yeah, it's hard to not think about the environmental or the climate change side of wildfire, because that's what it's all based around, like it's like, oh wow, okay, these like huge swings in temperature and like just like unpredictable weather patterns that are quite strange, and it's really hard to not notice that, I think, and to feel the heaviness of that as well. And I think working two seasonal jobs that are based around weather, kind of like it's very real, I think, to see that and to see what you can do about it, really. Or you're kind of just at the hands, you're kind of just like at the, in the hands of it, really, and trying to like manage it. But
and then I'm curious how that ties into like your winter job, right? Because obviously fighting fires is so visceral in terms of like it made the news, and wildfires are worse because of climate change. But how are you seeing that even on the snow side of things?
I think it's I think they go hand in hand, really. Like I think maybe I see the bigger swings in temperature this winter in particular, where we went from -30 to +2 degrees within 2 weeks. It's quite, and obviously that affects the snowpack and avalanche activity and stuff like that, and having like this almost this like it's like our second lowest snowpack year ever. It's hard to not think about next summer as well, and think about the drying trend and the warmer temperatures and just the like unpredictability.
This is kind of abstract, but how do you view climate change then? Are you kind of resigned and it's like it's gonna happen, things are so unpredictable, or you're in this, what kind of space are you in when you think about all this variability that climate change is introduced?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question to answer for sure, but it's pretty heavy, I think, and it's very noticeable, and it's almost funny, like in a way of having your winter job rely on the snowpack and kind of seeing that potentially dwindling in the next couple of years and being like, am I going to be out of work in the winter? But then seeing the trend that the summer's on, you're like, I guess I'm making up for it in the summers, but that is not a good thing. I think, you know.
You spent 2 seasons in fire. Are you going back for another season, and why? Why not?
Oh gosh, this is something that consumes my mind on the daily. You know, I think some days, even last summer when I was working, I was like, it goes back and forth so often where I'm like, I love this job. Like, I feel like I could do this forever. You know, like if I could just be on a chainsaw for like all day, every day, and be with my crewmates that I really love and care about, things are pretty good, you know, like this is, and it's such a niche work environment, you know, that you don't necessarily get. You're with 20 of probably the closest people to you that summer because you're working together, and you're in this very niche environment where you know, you do have like higher levels of anxiety and a bit more pressure, and it's like a very niche thing, I think, to live in that you can't necessarily get in other jobs, and I love it. Like, I think there's so much to that job that, you know, you're, I don't know, for me it's like your work is a way to serve, and I think working for a public service, I think, is a good way to fulfill that kind of role. Yeah, I think it's like the things that you're doing are really, really intense that you would not be able to live through in different ways. And the bonding that you make, that you have with your crew is so special, I think, because you're living through everything together, and you're trying to communicate well together, and you're working together, and you see a lot of different shades of different people as well, and you're there for them. You know, it's like the saying that's like, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, I think, is something that was thrown around 2 summers ago to me, and I think it's a pretty true thing, because it's like you want to build up your crewmates as much as you can because you're stronger together. You know, it's not a one-man show. Firefighting is not a single person responsibility. It's like, as when you work together, especially on a unit crew, when you have 20 people, and seeing how much you can get done with 20 people is really immaculate to me. Like, it's quite, it's a really cool feeling, I think, like being proud of your work and being proud of yourself and proud of your crew, I think, and the work that you put in is really quite special to me. And then the other side is sometimes I'm like, I can't do this anymore, you know? I'm like, this is it. Just because it is such a high demand, or it's a very demanding job, I think, in the summer, where summers like last year, you know, you don't get a lot of free time to yourself, and you don't get a lot of space to do other passions of yours, really. And I think sometimes I kind of struggle with that a bit, where, you know, you're doing this job that is so fulfilling, but I feel like I neglect parts of myself that are also really important to me. And, you know, I kind of ask myself, like, am I pushing myself the way that I want to be pushed, and am I challenging myself and growing in that way? And I think, you know, when you're exhausted and things are grim, it's easy to let those thoughts creep up and be like, do I want more for myself right now? And am I doing myself justice, I think, as well? And those are kind of big questions that I've been asking. And I think wildfire is so fulfilling and like so full of love and support. But a part of me also thinks that there's more to life than just working and fire.
I think a lot about where I find community and hope in a changing climate. And a lot of that is with other youth.
Hi, I'm Kat. I'm the Executive Director of the Foundation for Environmental Stewardship. We're a Youth for Youth sustainable development organization supporting young folks to finance, connect, equip, and amplify their work through our Youth Harbor and Now for Net Zero program.
Hi, I'm Jess, and I get to work with Kat at FES, and I'm the Program Director for the Now for Net Zero program. I think that education is a really powerful thing, especially when getting young people to empathize with scenarios that they weren't brought up in. Right? And getting them into spaces where they're pushed out of their comfort zone, they're learning about the world, other people, other problems that they have the privilege not to have to see every single day.
I think it's, you work so closely with young people and you see the light in their eyes and you're like, yes, we need these people to be able to build capacity, scale their initiatives, be in front of the camera, be the leaders and innovate. But at the same time, because we're so emotionally invested with a lot of these young people, when they're met with a lack of support from the institutions that had promised to, and you also see that disappointment, and then you kind of think to yourself, we have the energy in the youth, but it's squashed all the time.
That's tough.
And so Now for Net Zero is a program that we started a year ago, and the Youth Harbor is the one that we started 3 years ago. And that's when we realized, okay, where are we meeting young people? How do we meet them where they're at in terms of their advocacy and being able to fund them to not necessarily know the science per se. I mean, there's a lot of generalists out there. There's a lot of really amazing topical young academic experts, but where young people are good at is changing those cultural attitudes and those societal shifts because they know what needs to get done. They're not necessarily responsible for knowing all the nuances of how to do it. So the reality is if we actually look at the solutions in order to get us out of this crisis, or at least get us a little bit, at least to handle the crisis, I would say we have the finance, we have the money, we have the ideas, we have the capital, we have the tech, we have these solutions. I mean, in US markets alone, there's around $400 billion that's trapped in philanthropic funding. There's around $65 trillion caught in capital markets. We need $1.2 trillion a year to be able to get us closer to net zero and stay on track. So the capital's there, but I think really what we're missing is this political will aspect of it. I think a big failure of the climate world is comms. We haven't been able to really respond to the emotionality of comms. We add too much jargon into it. It's not accessible to people, but this is where youth come in. I mean, every single social justice movement has been complemented by a really strong and underlying youth. I mean, Tiananmen Square, civil rights movement, the Arab Spring, strikes for Black Lives Matter, even what we're seeing with Fridays for Future. There's always been a really complementary youth movement that has been able to enable the political will, the cultural shifts, the societal attitudes, and I think that's what we're missing right now, this sense, not necessarily of urgency, but of care for the problem. And I think maybe that's just a failure of the climate movement, is that we're so policy focused, we're so tech focused, we're so finance focused, but at the root of this is people. And upholding human dignity. And the best messengers of that message are
because they haven't been taken to the dark side yet. They're still optimistic. They're still challenging status quo in ways that we forget we even can sometimes. So I think it's an important voice that is underfunded and under-resourced and not taken as seriously in this. Clean tech might be flashy and might give you a little bit of hope because you think tech can solve it all, but we could throw all the tech spaghetti at the wall and still be in this situation.
And I have an example of that. I was talking to an Indigenous community that is in northern Alberta. And what she described to me was that they were displaced from their homelands because there was a lot of oil and gas. They wanted to frack. They wanted to extract from the land. So they were displaced. But now there's almost this second version of colonization when it comes to critical minerals. So there's this fire zone or fireland. I can't exactly remember. Ring of Fire. Yes. So there's this ring of fire, and this Indigenous community is on it. And now they want to displace them again. And now they're saying, if you cared about this problem as an Indigenous person, you would move so we could get the critical minerals to then have our batteries. And that's twice colonized again. So, obviously we need the technology to be ramped up, but we have to do it in an equitable way. We have to start with consultation at the margins and make sure, once again, that we're not perpetuating these same problems, because tech is not a silver bullet solution. All these clean tech solutions, we also need to talk about efficiency, we need to talk about resilience, we need to talk about adaptation, we need to talk about changing our cultural mindsets and our values, make sure that we're not too obsessed with this unlimited growth that is impossible. It's just not sustainable.
I think the spooky thing is, honestly, like, we've been to quite a few conferences, we've been to a few of these spaces where people are talking about clean tech and climate, and I think it even just shows, like, when you walk in the room, who's in the room, what kind of people are in that room, does that represent all of Canada? Not often. And I think that, yeah, if we, like, that room isn't going to come up with the thing that addresses all these intersectional issues that is the climate crisis.
Totally.
So I think, yeah, clean tech, obviously we know it has a role. It's important. It's really important now. People always talk about, like, well, this is the thing we have now before we can get to the dreamy place with fossil fuel phase out. But I think, again, sometimes it becomes too big of a distraction, too big of a crutch, too big of a greenwashing to keep us away from the actual, like, structural work and systematic work and equity work that needs to happen. I think we're even, like, yeah, when we started this project, it's like into year one now. We're just wrapping up year one of this project. And it's primarily working with high school agers because we're trying to engage young people at that age and teachers too, right? Because that's the way we learn about things. Climate literacy, the studies are out there. Climate literacy in Canada is abysmal. It's so pathetic considering who our peers are in this world. So I think when it comes to net zero, I can't even talk to you about net zero if you don't even understand emissions and how emissions relate to climate. And I can't talk to you about climate unless your teacher feels safe that their job's not on the line because they feel like climate is a nuanced conversation that might get them fired, kind of a thing. So I think we even, like, scale even further back and we don't even try to lean into, like, mitigation, adaptation, net zero. It's language more like, how do we understand our footprint? How do we understand lowering emissions at your school? And that's the priority, right? Because if we can get them to understand lowering emissions, then maybe we can broach the conversation, the nuance of net zero and offsets and all of that. So we're even starting way at the front line where it's like, okay, can you understand emissions? And the spooky thing that we're realizing is we're running this program, we're offering experiential education and project-based learning for high school students. So high school students, and with support of a teacher as well, have a student-led emissions reduction project at their school. We're trying to give them funding. And we're giving pretty large funding as well. Like most environmental orgs, they've got like $500 on the table, $1,000 for a school. We're saying, we'll give you $15,000. Like, dream big. What would you do if we could actually mobilize this? And it's really interesting because we talk about clean tech and all the solutions out there, but students, there's clearly a disconnect in literacy, and it could be at the board level, the teacher level, the curriculum, provincial level. But when students think, when we ask them to think big, you get some schools that go solar, some schools that start thinking about retrofits at their school, some that are doing the quick and dirty solutions like upgrading all the light bulbs because the board sits on their butt and they haven't got it done, but students are going to make it happen. Yeah. And then the next thing, they're like gardens, greenhouses, hydroponic systems, which have a place and a space in this movement. But even when you say emissions reduction, like, they can't even fathom what those solutions are, despite the fact that they exist, despite the fact that people are talking about these in other circles. So the conversation of net zero is even more so just like, what can you do as a community member in this building that you go to every single day? Do you understand energy in this building that you're in every single day? Do you understand what it's like in your home? Let's start there. And then, yeah, I think it's like solutions need to be talked about more.
Like, you're not going to have these schools, it sounds like, investing in carbon capture, right?
No,
it's so far removed.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting too, because I mean, we're asking these young people to carry the burden of understanding all the science when they're the ones that are not necessarily responsible for the harms that are being inflicted upon them.
It sounds like all of these foundational, societal, political structures that need to be functioning for youth and for these underrepresented communities in order to even think about what technology could look like in those communities, what youth using that technology could look like, what youth supporting that technology could even look like. Mm-hmm. And that's, I feel like, from what I've seen, is like really, and I'm sure from what you've seen, is really missing from a lot of these, like, hey, here's the technology and it's going to solve everything.
post and you talk about who's going to be actually utilizing that technology in terms of jobs. There's like not enough training. You know, a lot of these organizations are scrambling with geothermal and heat pumps. There's a huge demand for it because it's proven to be cheaper given specific circumstances, but it's expensive because there's not enough labor that's available. There's not enough training programs to train people on these new things. Young people want these jobs, but there's not enough funding to fund training programs to train them. And then once again, we get into this cyclical problem of young people. We're responsible to be able to solve climate change, but we are given none of the tools to actually do so.
The green skill gap is here. And it's really serious. And we're seeing a lot of programs come out of the government, like subsidy programs and support stuff like that. But I think it's education, it's training specific to communities as well, right? Like somebody was talking today about, like, you have skilled people working in certain factories and certain communities already. Like, how can you take those communities that are already in that space and how do you rework that for clean tech or green solutions or something like that? So it needs to be community focused. It needs to recognize this transition and the equity part of it as well. And I think youth, again, we got a tough hand that we've been dealt.
What does it take to do this systems change? I set out to find the answers. Over the next few episodes, I'm going to take a look at the transformation of some of our key industries in a changing climate. Industries like our transportation, our agriculture, our electricity, and even carbon removal, all of which are driven by feats in technology and engineering and capital. But perhaps most importantly, the people behind them all.
This is something that is so interesting always for me to think about. You often see the stat that like 100 companies are responsible for most of our emissions, and like, why are we putting the onus on individuals to really do anything? And I think I do think about that a lot, more so in the broader climate sense rather than the energy sense. And I think there's so much validity in like people have a limited amount of choices they can make, either awareness of the different choices they can make or just like ability to make those choices based on financial ability, whatever. I think like maybe speaking like idealistically, I would love to see in both scales, the like individual and household scale and in the company scale, people act from their values and make those choices even in an imperfect system, because I think that has a lot of value that goes beyond what people might see. Like people might think, me changing my diet as one individual, me, shifting from, shifting something in my house as one individual in the grand scheme of things is not doing that much for climate change. But the way I think about it is it has two impacts. One, it allows people to live in accordance with the values they probably already hold of wanting to take action on the climate crisis, which I think just like psychologically is an empowering feeling in an era where everyone's feeling a lot of climate anxiety and dread. I think making daily choices and daily actions that embody the values you hold is an incredibly powerful, not to be overlooked thing for the individual themselves. And I think the second benefit is the impact of them as a node of change in their own spheres of influence, whether that's in their families, their colleagues at work, or in the neighborhoods that they live in. I think seeing one individual do something that's maybe like against the grain or not quite yet normalized has these intangible impacts, because ultimately the policy changes, the systems changes that we're fighting for may result in those being the outcomes anyway. Like maybe in the future, if we have policies that enable people to make more energy efficient choices, everyone might have to switch to a more energy efficient dishwasher. They might suddenly have the opportunity to. Or if we have, unsustainable products or foods being fairly priced in the market, like maybe everyone would have to make these shifts anyway. And how valuable would it be for everyone to already know a colleague, a cousin, a daughter, a friend who has made that shift before and know how to do it, who can navigate them through that change, who has already kind of demonstrated that it's possible to live a really good life making this sustainable change when those policies do come about. I think that helps from climate and energy policies being overly top-down and kind of imposed on people, is if people are already acting as nodes of change and choosing to make these decisions, choosing these options, even in an imperfect system, they're kind of setting up the foundation for the future where those that are fighting for systems change, which often are the same people,